this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy. Be sure to check out our blog and our YouTube channel and our newsletter and our Facebook page and our great sponsors, Italy Rooting, Phil Italy, and Abitativa Casa. And my guest today is author Joe Cacibauda. And welcome, Joe. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this, Bob. I appreciate you, all the work you do to keep the culture going.
Oh, I appreciate it. You know, I just love it. I just love talking to people about it. So as we were talking in the pre-interview, I thought this was your second book. This was actually your first book, and it's about the Italian immigrants to Louisiana, correct?
Right, exactly, yeah. And it's called After Laughing Comes Crying, and the title comes from my dad. My dad used to tell us guys. There were four of us, four boys and one girl. And when the boys were screwing around, and we'd be back out in the field, and he'd be trying to get some work done, and we were messing around, he'd yell at us, after laughing comes crying. And it comes from a bunch of Italian proverbs. One of them is, he who laughs when he's young cries when he's old. And then there's a French proverb, he who laughs on Friday cries on Sunday. And then there's another Italian one, which is called, if a person sings before breakfast, he will cry before supper. So what all of that really means is that if you don't take care of business in the beginning when you're younger, when you get old, and that works for everything, finances and your health and the people you meet and associate with, if you don't take care of that when you're young, when you get old, it all comes back to haunt you. And so that's what that proverb is. So and my book takes place in it was based on the research that Vincenzo Scarpacci did on immigrants, on Sicilian immigrants on Louisiana plantations, and it was also based on the work that Donna Garbacci did on immigrants from Louisiana coming in, immigrants coming into Louisiana, and it's a historical fiction. I used my grandfather, who came to New Orleans in 1900. I used him as the main character in it. I think he did work on the plantation for a couple of times because he came in around October, and October was when all the immigrants came on to work on the plantations in Louisiana for it's called zuccherata, the harvesting of the sugar cane. And according to what Vincenzo says, is that actually sugarcane was at its best in November, but they hired all these workers to come in October to try to get the sugarcane in before any frost hit. So this is why, when you look at any of the Italians coming into New Orleans, usually they're coming in on a ship around October, and then they work that time in the sugarcane fields. So my story takes place. It starts in Sicily, and by the way, the picture behind me is Cacibauda, my little commune that my grandfather was from. I just visited this summer. I actually did in November. I just visited, and I still have relatives there.
You know, I just want to say something about that picture. You know what's so remarkable about that picture is you see the square, which looks like it's been redone and all new, and then you have all the old houses in the back.
Yes, exactly, and that's what they do. They redo the squares, the old houses back there. It's remarkable because it probably looks like it did when my grandfather left in 1900. And it was really interesting because we got there on November 1st, which is All Souls Day, and the next day is All Saints Day. I think I'm right on that. And in Italy, that's a big holiday because they give the kids they celebrate the departed ones, and they give kids gifts, saying that they come from ancestors. And so when we went there, we had a big feast, and there was a little girl there. And they were giving her gifts, and I said, "Oh, it's a birthday? No, it's All Souls Day." And they give gifts. It was sweet. It was very sweet. So anyway, getting back to my story. So my grandfather came to New Orleans in 1900, and like I said, I think he worked, but I believe my grandfather had more money than the rest because he bought a place within 2 years, and I don't think he would have been able to do that working on a plantation for 2 years. So, so anyway, that's so I use him as a character in the book, and it starts in this little commune, and it's after the unification, and so I just kind of want to get a little bit back history on the unification. There's a book out that's just been printed. It's right here. I don't know if I can see it. That you can see the book. It's called the Struggle for Sicilian Independence, and it's by Giuseppe Schiano. And Giuseppe, in his book, really argues with a lot of facts that the unification did not help Sicily at all. It was more like an invasion rather than anything else. And so, at any rate, the facts are that it did, and the farmers were not helped that much after that. So what would happen was that they would, every little thing they'd be taxed on. They'd have a person coming around looking and see how many rooms you had, and he would tax you on that. How many animals you had, he would tax you on that. And the interesting thing is that the big landowners, their horses were exempt from taxes, but the donkeys for the peasants were taxed. So the family tax that the communities, the individual judgments on the community, everything was going to pay taxes. And by the way, some of these people, a lot of these peasants did own land, but it was hard to keep it because of the taxes. So, and my book starts in this little community, and these guys are planning to take back some of their land, and which has been either stolen during the invasion, during Garibaldi's during the war. Were either stolen by people, the landowners saying, "Oh, this property's been abandoned," so they redo titles, or they said they owe taxes on it. And anyway, they acquired all this land, and it just sat there because a lot of these owners lived in the north, and it just sat there. So anyway, that's kind of how my story begins. Now, this was about my story takes place about 1880, and before that, though, when Garibaldi started his campaign, just about that time in America, the Civil War was beginning, and it's an interesting thing that Lincoln actually offered Garibaldi an office in the Union Army, and he turned it down. And Garibaldi lived in New York for a while, and but anyway, he turned it down.
I just learned that, literally learned that like 2 days ago.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he lived there with I think a writer.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.co. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. And that he was offered, that Lincoln offered him a
Yeah,
role in the war.
he did. Yeah. Uh-huh. And so getting to the war, at the end of the Civil War, uh, the plantation owners came back and the farmers came back to fields that were, the soldiers that had been marching over them, had been fighting in the fields. And what would happen is a bunch of soldiers would come in and they start killing all the livestock to eat. And of course, to build fires, they would tear down the fences, or you can imagine, they'd probably go to a porch and pull out a post or something to have a fire. So, some of these houses were all broken and torn apart. The fields were all decimated. But the other thing that happened was that they had no more labor. The labor had scattered in all directions. Some of the blacks joined the Union Army, and some of them went elsewhere to try to find their relatives that had been sold off. Some of them stayed, and because they had no place to go, they didn't own anything, so they didn't have anything to do. So they stayed on the plantation. The only thing is, after a while, the plantations owners were required to have a contract with these people, with their laborers. And so that didn't sit well with the southern plantation, who had slaves all this time. Didn't sit well with them. So that was one of the reasons why they started looking elsewhere for labor. Also, during Reconstruction, we tend to think, oh, okay, well, the thing was over, everything was settled. No, you still had Southerners who were occupied by the Northerners, and they were still fighting. They would burn down places, and they weren't ready to have slaves negotiate with plantation owners. So, like I said, some of the slaves came back, but they came back and they started saying, well, we don't want to do all that work. We don't want to do it for that much money. And the plantation owners had mortgages to pay, and they had to rebuild. They hadn't made any money because they weren't selling any crops. So they were in pretty bad shapes. So here I've got some quotes from some of the owners at the time. One of them says, "The Negro cannot furnish either a quality or quantity the labor necessary to develop the South. By its lack of initiative and inventive genius, the black race has acted as a hindrance to progress." And another one says, "For years, Negro labor in the South has been growing more worthless and unreliable." What that meant is that they had to pay them. That's why they were worthless. "With plenty of work to do good wages, the Negroes will not accept employment. But on the contrary, the tendency among them is to leave the country." They meant leave the rural country. They didn't mean America. "Leave the country and seek the cities where they can eke out a miserable existence." So plantation owners decided they needed to go elsewhere to get laborers. So they went to New York and they hired a bunch of Germans, and the Germans came down into the South, and they said, "Oh no, we can't handle this." So they went back. They hired a bunch of Chinese, and the Chinese said, "Hey, this is great. There's good fishing down here, good hunting and good trapping." So they went into that and left the plantation. They started fishing and hunting and trapping down there. So before a little bit after the war, Italians, especially Sicilians, had been coming into New Orleans with the citrus, because Sicily had a lot of citrus, and so they would send the people in Sicily would send people down to New Orleans, and they send specialists who knew how to handle the fruit and get it into the stores and get it to the people without, because it was pretty delicate. There was no, they didn't put them in warehouses for a long time. They didn't do any of that. They picked the fruit, put it in crates, and shipped it off to the States, to at least New Orleans. So a lot of these Sicilians stayed in New Orleans, and rather than keeping going back and forth, they stayed. So around that time, about 3,000 Sicilians were coming in a year to take care of the fruit and stay. But by 1850, New Orleans had become one of the largest Italian settlements in the country. And so merchants and planters in New Orleans knew something about the area. The Sicilians knew something about the areas. So Louisiana said, well, we need laborers, and they knew what bad shape Sicily was in. So they got together and they created the Louisiana Bureau of Immigration. And the Bureau was formed by the planters, and it hired recruiters, usually Sicilians who had relatives in Sicily. It hired them to go to Sicily and recruit workers. And so that's what they did. They went to Sicily and they recruited workers. Now the idea was that they would buy them a ticket and have them come over. Now, to recruit people, in the last decade, 1,500 Italians have disembarked at the port of New Orleans. These immigrants are strong, healthy, able-bodied, industrious laborers. They have no superiors. They have come here to search for homes as they are attracted by our temperate climate and fertile resources. Capitalist planters, owners, railroad contractors, everybody that hires laborers in great numbers find the Italian immigrant a valuable acquisition because of his willingness and his peculiar adaptability to hard work. So that's what that little thing did. Recruiting was a little bit tricky because the Congress passed a law. It was called the Alien Contract Law. And you couldn't contract any laborers and bring them over. But there were a lot of loopholes. And one of the loopholes was the states enforced that. So Louisiana, they were going to enforce that. They were bringing in labor. They just probably, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm sure what they did is when they came over through Ellis Island, actually it was Castle Garden at first. But when they came over, they probably just told them, say no, when they said, did anybody promise you work? That's probably what they probably did. There were other loopholes if you were a specialist. You could come over pretty much like it is today, really. If you were a specialist, you could come over. And a Sicilian who knew about citrus fruit, could say he's a specialist and they need to hire him. He was a specialist in growing sugar cane. There were loopholes that they could get around to it. The interesting thing about these commercials, just like everything, steamship companies and railroads were joined together and helped recruit these immigrants coming in. But then there were people who were cheating the system. And also because of this thing about the states policing the immigrants coming in, that's why they built Ellis Island. They had to have a federal way of having immigrants coming into this country. So they built Ellis Island, and they instead of them coming into Castle Garden, they came into Ellis Island, and now the feds could control immigration. Uh, a lot of there were a lot of immigrant ports, immigration ports into the country. Philadelphia had one, Boston, Baltimore, but in the South, at Key West, Florida, and Galveston, and of course New Orleans were ports of entry to coming in. And a lot of immigrants who came into, say, New York, they may have had relatives, but they didn't have jobs, so they stayed in New York. I mean, that was the closest place to go. They came into Boston, they stayed in Boston, Philadelphia. They stayed out. They weren't going to try to go across the country and go west. And so that's why we have a lot of immigrants who stayed in New York, Boston, and in the Northeast. But the ones that came to Louisiana usually had relatives there, and so they had a place to go. I mean, you had to have somebody on the farm anyway. So a relative or somebody to even get into the country. So anyway, so they started recruiting these Italians to come on in, and so there was another reason why they went to Italy to get workers. Is that in the South, the Southern plantation owners and the Southern politicians wanted to recruit white workers to come in for their votes. They wanted, if they were gonna substitute labor, they wanted to have white labor coming in and to help overturn, because the Negro was starting to be able to vote. So that was another reason why they started bringing in the Italians. And this is from a newspaper then. Immigration may not only cure or greatly palliate most of our state's troubles, but it may make the state far more prosperous and wealthy than it has ever been. To whom can our landholders sell millions of acres of untilled land if not to immigrants? Without a large addition of the white producing population of the state, what will prevent the best lands of Louisiana from depreciating into their market value until they will no longer sell for $1 an acre from being swallowed up by taxes? So that was another reason why they it's not only the labor, but they wanted to try to bring in white people too. Another article here starts the idea of, well, if we bring in these white people and we can't afford our plantations, let's start selling them the land. So this was from the Times-Picayune. I've already furnished an article for the Picayune in which I urge merchants who own sugar estates that yearly run them in debt and planters who cannot make money out of colored labor to divide their plantations into 10, 20, or more small farms. With such building and improvements as may be needed, and select enough good working, honest white families to occupy these farms and furnish cane for a central sugar house in connection with supplies of cane for neighboring plantations. These small farms could be leased to white farmers or sold on long time by planters who are in debt, and the mortgage notes could be turned into pay the debts. So here they floated the idea of also selling off the land. So a lot of these Italian people who worked on a plantation, and they didn't make that much. I'll let you know in a bit how much they made.
We'll be right back.
Hey, book lovers, I'm Sarah, and I co-host Reading Between the Lines podcast with my mom, Nicole. While we might have totally different tastes in fiction, we definitely share the same passion for great stories. And on our podcast, we dive into honest reviews and thoughtful recommendations to help you skip the books you won't finish and find the ones you will absolutely love. Whether it's dark academia, literary fiction, or even thrilling sci-fi, which is my favorite, Nicole and I have you covered. Subscribe to Reading Between the Lines now, wherever you listen to podcasts, and let us help you discover your next favorite read.
A lot of them started with this idea in mind. They came and started saving their money. And so another article says, every one of these Italian families, after paying all expenses, they mean the ones working on the plantations, after every year, they save a few $100s, which they deposited in local American banks, and they sent the part home to Italy. So they save their money. At this time, land could be bought for about $10 to $20 an acre. And some of it even sold for as little as $2 an acre.
Wow.
So these plantation workers, like I said,
Did they like band together to buy pieces of property, like maybe several families or whatever?
Kind of. What happened would be, and this happened, I'm pretty sure, with my family. My family still owns about 110 acres of a plantation up in around Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's called Fort Oge. And what I think what happened in my family is a cousin or someone came down and bought a part of the plantation, and when they came, when my grandfather came into the country, the cousin said, "Hey, the January plantation is selling off land. You know, they got 100 acres," and so in that sense, they did band together. But I didn't come down as a group, you know, a real estate group to buy up land. Not at all. Not at all. So they formed these truck farms, and what I just found out about truck farms is I thought truck farms meant that these farmers had trucks. That's not what truck means. Truck is an old term, and it means vegetables grown for market. So these truck farmers were growing vegetables for market, but I thought that was pretty interesting because I always wondered truck farmers. But truck means a little something, a little insignificant something, or these vegetables that are grown. So, so for instance, it said some families cultivated truck gardens, less than 20 acres. So these guys, these farmers, started planting these little farms of 10 acres or so, and then started to sell the vegetables. Some of them, incidentally, each plantation gave the workers, when they came with their family, they gave them a little area around the house for their own garden. That when they went to Sicily, this is what they told the people. And that would happen when they got to the States. Giovanni's contract, that's the character of my story, stated that he would board a ship in October. He'd sign on to work for Mr. John Diamond on the Bel Air sugar plantation in southern part of the American state of Louisiana for a term of 6 months. For this, he would be paid $20 a month plus room and board. One half of the salary would be paid every month. The other half retained for 6 months to be certain the contract was fulfilled. He was guaranteed a $22 ticket in steerage to be issued at the steamship's dock. His contract called for the fare to be deducted from his pay only if he did not honor the contract and stay the full 6 months. The balance of his pay would be paid after 6 months, minus any time not worked. Ships regulation limited the size of baggage to 36 inches long, 18 inches wide, and 12 inches deep. Giovanni would stuff his worldly belongings within his piece and fill a large pillowcase with all necessities, especially food and softer items and other clothing. Many immigrants wore 2 or 3 sets of clothing rather than packing them away. He would arrive in America wearing a handed-down suit from an uncle's wedding, towing 160 lira, about $30, in the lining and keeping about 25 liras, which is about $5, in his pocket for spending. Also, within the pockets, Giovanni would carry a paper called a nulla osta, a permission to immigrate, and his contract with the plantation owner. I don't think he would show his contract, but I don't know. By the way, this I'm reading you is from Vincenzo Scarpacci's book. I mean, the conditions. The writing's mine, but the conditions. He would also carry necessary papers to enter the port of New Orleans, indicating his last residence, his final destination, whether he had a ticket to his final destination, and if so, who paid the ticket. He would have to show whether he had ever been in the United States before, and if so, when. And the papers would need to give the name and address of the person he planned to meet. Whether he had ever been in prison or been a polygamist, anarchist, or mentally unfit, physically unfit, and all that stuff. So we pretty much know about those conditions. Let's see. Yeah, the trip to Palermo. I once asked the person, I was insisting, I said, well, how do they get from these little comunes to Palermo? He said, on a donkey. So actually, what they would do is they'd take a donkey and they'd go to the nearest railroad station and get on a train that would go into Palermo. So during the 1800s, many northern Italian immigrants left through ports of Havre, Marseille, Nice in France, and Genoa. But in the south, the southern Italians left from Napoli and Palermo. So I could read more. To be sure, the immigrants had experienced more crowds in Bedlam than they had ever seen in their lifetimes. The sheer numbers waiting to board trains to Palermo and the horde of passengers arriving from different locations at Palermo dock. The wandering souls and massive assortments of baggage, and they covered the wharf all helter-skelter against the background of waiting ships. The persistent hawkers selling holy water, health insurance, religious artifacts, baubles to ward off bad luck, the permeating smell of roasted nuts and assorted meats and cheese, and the odor coming from long stored clothing and sweating bodies. So you can imagine what it must have been.
It doesn't sound too pleasant.
Doesn't sound too pleasant. No, not at all. So and the trip, I think, I read somewhere where it took a month or so, but after they started with the steamships, I think it took less time. I think it took about a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think to New York could be, I think, anywhere from like 7 to 10 days.
Yeah.
Something like that once. But the conditions, even in the steamships, the conditions weren't very nice. Because they were down in steerage and had very little to eat and would rarely. I think they would get maybe an hour to come up on the deck. They would clear out the first class passengers and let them get some air or something like that. But
And I believe in my research too that they would pick out a leader in the bottom and they'd give him a bucket, and everybody had a bucket, I believe, and for like soup and stuff like that. That's why the Italians brought their own food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, they brought their own food. But anyway, that couldn't have been very pleasant.
So,
So,
approximately, if you know, when your grandfather got there in 1900, approximately, do you know how many Italians were in New Orleans at the time?
I saw that earlier. I think it was about. Let me see. I did have that down. I skipped over the reading, but it was uh, by that time there were a lot of Italians, a lot of Italians there. It was by then one of the biggest Italian settlements, in the country because there was work there. And not only, I'm talking about sugarcane, but there was also cotton,
Hmm.
the cotton too. So there were a lot of, I don't know the exact number, but uh,
But were they readily accepted? Because I
no,
know I know
no,
they weren't.
not
Yeah,
really.
I didn't think so.
No,
Yeah.
no. And to top it off, there was yellow fever going around, and they were blamed for bringing it into the country. Uh, and a lot of the even after a while on the plantations, um, at first they didn't. Um, they got along with the black workers on the plantation, but after a while, the black workers saw them as taking their jobs, and they weren't too friendly either. After a while, so and then in other places, uh, some of the Italians, as they came into the country and worked the plantation, some of them started leaving the plantations and going north to work on the railroads. And the unions up there in the north at first didn't want them coming in, and the other places in the south, the workers in the south didn't want them, so they had a lot of uh, a negative reaction to them coming into the country.
Yeah, and just go back to what you said earlier about unification. A lot of people don't realize that unification, yeah, I guess that unified the country and there's the thought of independence and all of that kind of stuff. But they, the North, when they went south, they pretty much devastated the whole socioeconomics of the South. And the South had
Yeah,
money,
yeah,
like you said, and the North
yeah,
stole it. But
yeah,
but like you said, all of these, the land was owned by the nobility, and they, they pretty much, for lack of a better word, cared for the people because they had the jobs, they had them farm and all of that kind of stuff. And like you said, when that when Garibaldi did all of this stuff, that all disappeared, and land, you mentioned it, land was just left fallow.
yeah. The interesting thing about that is the same thing was happening in the South in America because after the Civil War, the the Union and the Northern politicians came into the South and they ran everything. And you couldn't run for office in the South. So it was kind of the same thing. So the Southerner, he was, they were in a sense, uh, um, um, I can't think of the right word, but overwhelmed by the Northern ideas, the old Northern culture, and all that stuff. So that's why they didn't take it too kindly either, and because it changed the way they were living too, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Uh,
the other big misconception in the South too is that, the whole three-fifths thing, where blacks were three counted as three-fifths. And I remember in school a long time ago that it was kind of taught that they thought less of the black people. That's why it was only three-fifths, but that wasn't the case. It had to do with
no,
the North not wanting to count all the black slaves as full people because they didn't want the South to have the power in Congress.
yeah, that's right. But when my grandfather came in, of course he came in 1900. It was a different thing there. Um, So, but anyway, getting back to this is what a plantation looked like when some of these immigrants came in. I'm going to do from my reading. The plantation ground looked like a small village with houses on both sides. This is also from Vincenzo Carpacci's book. A large smokestack loomed prominently above the landscape, tall enough to be seen even against the night sky. The wagons inched their way down the road, dropping off men at dwellings. Some duplexes, others long complexes of apartments, side by side, looking like motel rooms. When men in the light of day, all of the dwellings were unpainted, grayed by weather and time, sitting atop cinder block, two simple steps climbed an open porch that ran as wide as the front of the house. These were the dwellings in which the immigrant families lived. Planting and harvesting sugarcane in the mid-1800s was a never-ending series of difficult processes. From planting to harvesting, over a 3-year cycle, the beginning of a crop would begin with seed, cane extracting from the ground with large, heavy iron hooks attached to poles. Once out of the ground, the workers would load the stalks into carts to be carried to the fields for planting. Women were used to bundle the cane. But I have women here, but I read somewhere else where the women were seldom sent out into the field, the Italian women. So I think they're probably talking about black slave women here, because the Italians very rarely sent women out to the field. At least in Sicily, in Italy, they did. Anyway, they were followed closely by another group of men who pulled the cane stalks and bundled the canes and placed them end to end. And in the early days, the Italians didn't do this, the sophisticated work, the blacks did. So in the early days, the Sicilians were under the supervision of the black workers, because the black workers knew what to do. So, and by the way, the Sicilians had no biases either way. They were there to work. You know, they didn't have an agenda at all. In the spring, workers moved dirt away from cane roots to allow germination. And that's the job the Italians did. They did all the hoeing. They built out the canals, the ditches. Weeks later, they would back recover the cane, all the while managing weeds. And this is all the work that the Italians did. Later in the season, the cane needed to be thinned and furrowed, dug open. And throughout all these processes, ditches needed to be remain clear. Weeds needed to be taken away, disposed of. And the workers needed to harvest and grind the cane in the next 3 months. So they would haul it onto these big wagons and then bring it off to the grinding machine. In November, it had to be harvested before the frost, so most growers did this in October. It was expected that these men, and sometimes the women, would eventually harvest several tons of cane daily and work 12 to 14 hours a day for about 65 cents a day. But that was a lot of money then, I guess. This is from a doctoral thesis. There was another reason besides labor to bring in immigrants to the South, and certain political parties thought that they could get the white immigrants to vote for them. This is what I said earlier. And so, but what happened was, as the Italians, as they went up north, as they went into other places, and they were able to vote, they kind of stuck together in who they supported, and which is typical.
That's normal, I suppose.
That's normal. Yeah. The political bosses in New Orleans, and this is a quote: the political bosses in New Orleans want to make the Dagos citizens and disenfranchise the Negroes. and God knows if there's any difference between them, it's largely in the darkies' favor. If we may judge the quality now being imported here as plantation laborers. So that kind of answers your question about were they welcome. Some people did welcome. And I sent you a picture of a newspaper thing that had a picture of what they thought.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw, I'll put that up. Yep.
Yeah. So, like I said, they started experiencing some of this bigotry. Italians neither loved nor respected the southern states. He's desired as a useful and exploitable instrument of labor, but personally he's considered a sort of white-skinned Negro who is better worker than the black-skinned Negro. That's from an article there too. However, like I said, the Sicilians did not behave as expected. For one thing, they were very independent and driven to succeed, and Americans, both white and black, began to resent them. So they didn't kind of go the way they were expected to go. So anyway, so the book takes them to that, and it has them working on a plantation, and it has mostly fictional situations, but the fiction is built around factual information about what went on with the plantation and everything else. From what I read, the blacks were separated from the Italians. The blacks were in the back of the plantation, and the Italians and the other white workers were in their own little town. That's what
you know what's really interesting about all of this? I was just thinking, when we see whether it's movies, television shows, whatever, right? Never, ever have you ever seen anything that shows Italians on plantations, Italians in the South. It's not there.
No, it's not there. And this is a couple of reasons why I wrote this book. Is one, I was doing family research, and because my name has been changed, and people think, well, yeah, they got the Ellis Island, and they said, nah, we'll change it. No, Italians had very good records, very good records. So that name change was my family's own doing. I don't know why my grandfather did it, but there are other. It should be pretty much longer. It's Cacibauda. And Caccia means a hunter, and Baudo is actually from German, and it means courageous. I don't think we were courageous hunters, but we were all farmers. But at any rate, it was changed. The family changed it. It wasn't changed in New Orleans or Ellis Island. And they had very good records. You had to have good records. You had to have your full name. And the women kept their maiden names.
Yeah, they still do.
They still do.
They still keep their maiden names.
They still do, yeah.
Which makes it in some ways that makes it easier for us Italians to trace back.
Yeah, made it very easy to trace the lineage. And so that's why I wrote it. And then Vincenzo Scarpacci did a thesis for New York University, and it was Sicilians on Louisiana plantation, and it's a marvelous book. And then Scarpacci, Donnie Scarpacci, did a book about laborers coming over, and some of them got into politics, and some of them, like they joined the unions when they went up north, and the unions loved them because they didn't, they were staunch union people, and plus the union probably didn't control how they voted, and
that was But they still do that.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that.
Some
Yeah,
things don't
yeah,
change, I suppose.
yeah.
Uh,
So, I mean, yeah, you're right. That's a segment of labor, of the Italian labor that no one knows about. We all know about the Italians who built, they dug the tunnels in New York for the skyscrapers. I mean, that was a big deal. And there's a great book out, Payday, I think it's called. And it's about what they went through to dig the foundations for these skyscrapers. It was like working in a mine.
mhm.
And they had to go down and dig under this ground and put those skyscrapers in. But a lot of people don't know about the Italians in the South coming down. There's a lot of Italians in Texas, around Houston, and farmland too.
Well, even and in Florida too. I mean, we lived in Florida
Florida
for a
too.
while, and
Yep.
Ybor City, that's where all the cigar factories were, and
Yeah.
it was all Italians making the cigars, and also the citrus industry and all of that kind of stuff.
And Italians who ended up in San Francisco usually came in the country from through New Orleans, because that was the closest port to the west. There was no Panama Canal, so so they got on a train in New Orleans and went west. And of course,
Yeah, you see, we never see an Italian in those Western movies, right?
No, I've never seen Italians in the Western movie. But because west was Kansas, Missouri, that was the West.
Yeah,
we,
yeah.
we think of the West, California, but in those days, West was Missouri, Kansas,
That's
Minnesota of all places. So, yeah.
So, Joe, before we go,
Uh-huh.
what's the name of the book again, and where can people
The name
find
of the
it?
book is After Laughing Comes Crying. I think I sent you the cover.
Yep.
I can't see me, so I don't know how it is. I can't see me. But it's After Laughing Comes Crying. It's published by Lagos, but it's sold by Arbacicula, which is a great Sicilian organization. I recommend Sicilians who want to learn about their history to look up Arbacicula.
Well, fantastic. And thanks again for being here. I really appreciate it. Great stuff for sure.
Oh, good. I appreciate you. Like I say, I appreciate you doing this, and because I know it's hard work, and because I see the amount of stuff you put out, and the great stuff you put out too, and it's a great legacy, and that'll keep going on, and that's what we need to do, is record our history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to make sure everybody knows what happened and all of that.